Welcome to the Capstone Conversation, the East Bay's best podcast. Hosted by Jared Asch, bringing you in-depth conversations with the leaders shaping your community.
Today, I am joined by Dan Walters from CalMatters. Dan, I appreciate you joining me today.
Sure. Dan and I were just talking before I hit record.
He has been writing words about California politics since 1981. Dan, just give us an overview, intro to yourself and your background before we dive into California politics today.
I've been in this business racket, profession, trade, whatever you call it, journalism, since 1960. I'm going up on 66 years, more or less. I started when I was 16 years old, went to work for a daily newspaper when I was 16. Dropped out of high school because newspaper was more fun than high school. Started writing color. I did work at, and even was the editor of several smaller newspapers around California and Oregon for a number of years. Finally landed in Sacramento in the early 70s and started covering the Capitol politics in 1975, about 2 months after Jerry Brown started his first governorship. And in 1981, I started writing a daily column. Call it daily because more than 3 times a week it's considered to be daily. First for the Sacramento Union for a few years, for 33 years for the Sacramento Bee, to the last 9 years for CalMatters.org. I write 4 columns a week, and they are distributed to anybody who wants them, basically, including newspapers or other publications that might want to reprint them. CalMatters is a nonprofit organization, and all the material we do, my columns, are free of charge to anybody who wants.
In 1975, when Jerry Brown was first sworn in, did you expect to see him back in the 2000s here as governor?
I think I assumed he was one and done as governor. Who would have thought come back 28 years later or something? No, but it was obvious that he had political ambitions. By the time he left the governorship, he'd already run for president twice. And he did it a third time in the early 90s. And he also tried to run for the U.S. Senate in California and lost. He had political ambitions. We all knew that. And I covered all those ambitions, traveled around the country with him when he was running for president a couple of times. But no, I never saw him coming back as governor again. It's a unique experience. In fact, the time between governorships was long, and I was one of the very few people still around who remembered his first governorship. But mostly I was a repository of the details of his first administration when he came back. And then, of course, naturally you gauge his first one against his second one, or his second one against his first one. And I was the only person, or very few of us had that kind of institutional knowledge of his first governorship.
Let's first, before we get into history and California today, let's talk about how reporting has changed and news media has changed since the 70s, since 2000 to what it is today. Give us your perspective on how it has evolved, maybe some of the impact on social media and online.
In the macro sense, the change has been incredible. When I started in the newspaper business in 1960, and still in 1975 when I started covering the Capitol, newspapers dominated news coverage. Those of us in the newspaper business were sitting on top of the world in a sense. Newspapers were very profitable. We had a lot of staff people, a lot of people at the Capitol covering the Capitol. It was the salad days for the newspaper business. And that lasted through more or less the 1990s. But in the 1990s, we started some of the newspaper models start to stray. Classified advertising, for example, which was played a very important role in newspaper finances, was undermined by internet, free ads on the internet and that sort of thing. Newspaper industry didn't understand how much it was being challenged. It had made so much money and had been dominant for many decades The people, the executives in the business just missed the boat. They just didn't see it coming. By the time they did see it coming, it was basically too late. And we all have seen what happened. Newspapers are shut down. Those who haven't shut down have cut their staffs dramatically. The McClatchy family newspaper had gone for over 150 years, but it was forced into bankruptcy. That model having really been demolished, the economic model of the newspaper business. Now we have all these multiple things gathered into the term of media, but it's a bewildering tsunami of fact and fancy and opinion and analysis. We're all buried in it. A lot of it is completely phony. There's this great search within the journalism tree for a model that works. It could be accurate and timely and also have enough wherewithal to support itself. CalMatters is one of those experiments. When I left the B to go to CalMatters in 2017, CalMatters was about 2 years old. And I think I was employee maybe 10 or 12. Today we have over 80 employees. We're still here. We've grown tremendously. It's a nonprofit organization. We are supported by people who donate, from individuals to foundations, the corporations. We maintain our independence. It's working so far. Whether this is the new model or not, I don't know. As far as it seems to be working. And there are many of the smaller nonprofit or news agencies have popped up all over in California and actually all over the nation. And are all trying to find that magic formula to sustain themselves and still do professional journalism.
The Embarcadero Company, we've had them on, and they run a number of weekly papers in small towns in the Bay Area, and they're a hybrid, still selling the ads, but have moved to a nonprofit to take in foundation and corporate money.
Covering the Capitol has changed pretty dramatically too. When I started covering the Capitol in 1975, if you wanted a bill, you had to go to the bill room in the Capitol and stand in line, get a bill. If you wanted an analysis of the bill, you had to go to the committee and beg them a copy of the analysis for you. And it was a very much hands-on. If you wanted to know what was going on in the bill and committee, you had to go listen to the committee hearing and wait for the bill to come up. Same thing on the floor sessions. The internet has made all of that much, much easier. You can look at any legislative hearing, any floor session. You got copies of the bills, all the analyses, all the paperwork involving bills is available. And in CalMatters, we've advanced that idea even further by creating something called digital democracy, in which not only do we have all of the data on each bill, but the data on each member of the legislature. If you're interested in a bill, and you can call up the video of the hearing, not only the video of the hearing, but it'll go to the exact place in the hearing when that bill was taken up. We'll give you all the testimony for and against. It will list all the people who testified, and it will translate all of that into text. As you're listening or viewing the video, it will also appear on your screen in the form of text. Those tools make the logistics of covering the Capitol infinitely easier than it ever was in press. Yes, the Capitol Press Corps has probably less than half of what it once was, but the coverage has not become half because it's easier in many ways to do what you need to do. Not so much of your time is taken up with the logistics of it. You can devote more time to the actual journalism.
Let's hit on one word you touched in there, or two different words. One is truth, and then I'll come up to democracy, the second one. But there has been a lot of back and forth about truth in media and what are true sources today, and what do you believe? What advice do you have out there for listeners about how to sort through all the content?
It's very tempting if you're a consumer of media to only patronize those who slant their coverage along your own ideological proclivities. In other words, you become part of the choir and they're preaching to the choir. First of all, it's somebody who is truly interested in knowing, trying to figure out what's going on, should stay away from all of those partisan or ideological sources and try to patronize the much hated mainstream media, much hated by those who are peddling all of that propaganda. There, somebody comes on one of those video sites or something, and the first thing you always say is, I'm going to tell you a story that the mainstream media are bringing up. If you're really interested, go to the mainstream media. You go to the people who are not aligned with one political faction or another, and go to several. Not everybody's going to have a full take on it. Go to several, read several newspapers if the newspapers are still available, or news sites or whatever, if you're really interested in trying to figure out what's going on. Not that we're all by any means error-free or complete as we probably should be, but at least the mainstream media try to be objective within the objective and try to verify the facts. And if you're really interested, that's what you do. If you just want to have somebody buttress your ideological prejudices, then stay with one of those slanted organizations and they'll tell you everything you want to know because they know what you want to hear and they'll give it. It's a matter for the consumer has to make that choice of deciding whether to go with the choir or look at more independent sources.
Let's bring it back to this notion that Governor Gavin Newsom talks about democracy is in danger under Trump, that fair elections may not happen in the future. You've seen Prop 50 pass in the matter of redistricting here in California. You have Newsom talking about how if the Democrats don't win the House in 2026, democracy could end. What are your thoughts on that?
The demise of democracy has been forecast many times along the way. We survived a civil war without blowing up. Look, democracy is always under threat by people who want to bend the system their way. Yes, Donald Trump has proclivities in that way, but then other presidents have. He's been more, I guess you'd say, more outspoken and transparent about his efforts to tilt the scale his way. But it happens all the time. It happens right here in California. What is Proposition 50 except trying to tilt the system your way? That's what the Democrats with Proposition 50. But they were doing that even before. I've been through several rounds of redistricting in California, and there was nothing democratic about any of them, even though the Democrats were the ones who were doing it. They were twisting the system to maximize their seats in Congress and in the legislature. And finally, the voters of California said, that's enough of that. We want to have an independent commission do that, which was passed by the voters over the objections of politicians from both parties. For example, from Nancy Pelosi, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And I would say, this thing sounds cynical, but I think it's realistic. It's doubtful whether we'll ever go back to independent redistricting, at least for Congress, even though this is only supposed to last for the next couple of cycles. All these congressmen who will get their seats, extra congressmen get these extra seats in this year's election, are they going to want to give them up after a couple more cycles? Plus the fact that California is likely to lose about 4 or 5 seats after the next census. They have 5 extra seats and then 5 seats go away. There's going to be, and probably Congress will be just as evenly divided in as it is now. There's going to be a lot of pressure on California to continue the gerrymander to maximize Democratic seats. When we talk about undermining democracy, it's not just Donald Trump. It's a lot of things going on that undermine democracy. I have seen, for example, as the Capitol has become a more one party utterly dominated by one party, this level of secrecy has gone up tremendously. It's much harder to find out things that are going on because much stuff has now gone on behind the scenes in the Capitol. Things that used to be done openly are now done clandestinely. Gavin Newsom has had a great proclivity for burying substantial matters of public policy into budget bills at the very end of the session without virtually no ability to even know what they're doing, much less be able to figure it out. There is a lot of secrecy and hide the peace sorts of much more going on in the Capitol now than there was after it became dominated by one party. The point is, democracy in the broadest sense has been undermined in California just as much as it may be being undermined in Washington. The political instincts are political instincts. The political instincts are you try to tilt balance wheel your way, any way you can, whether it's the secrecy or gerrymandered districts or whatever it might be. Yes, democracy is under attack, but it's not only under attack in Washington, D.C., it's also under attack in Sacramento, California.
That good perspective. Governor Gavin Newsom, biggest accomplishment in your eyes and biggest failure?
He's had a couple of things I think were positive. One of them is he has been willing to create, and this doesn't get very much publicity, but it's a very important thing, a more detailed data on how the education system is working, called a longitudinal data system. His predecessors as governor, particularly Jerry Brown, didn't like that idea, but he's embraced it. I think that's a very good thing. He's now converting San Quentin prison to a rehabilitation center on the Norwegian model. It started, but how it's going to turn out, we don't know. And there's many of these things, particularly in the criminal justice system. We've downgraded many crimes. We've made this whole system less punitive. How's that going to work on the long run? We don't know. He leaves the governorship in a year with a lot of things started, but not necessarily gone far enough that you can actually create judgment. He was a big promiser. Unlike Jerry Brown in his second term, who didn't promise anything. He came in and promised the moon. He was going to have single payer health care. He was going to build 3.5 million new housing units. He was going to solve homelessness for all time. I would say that it's fair to say that all of the issues that he said he would address in 2011 will still be there for his successor a year from now. Homelessness is not going to be resolved. We still haven't not building enough houses. The healthcare system is basically still what it was then. And he overpromised, and he promised things a knowledgeable person would know were impossible, like building 3.5 million units of housing. It wasn't going to happen. It couldn't happen. It was physically impossible. Single payer healthcare was impossible to do because you would have to persuade the federal government, which pays half of the medical bills in California, by the way. 50% of all the medical is financed through Medicare, Medicaid, retiree health care, all that stuff. And the federal government provides half of that. State government pays very little of it is actually paid by consumers or employers. It's basically a state and federal healthcare system. But to have a single payer system, you'd have to get the feds to give you all that money and let you spend it the way you want to spend it. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen under any president or any Congress. It's an impossibility. But he said he was going to do it anyway. Yes, we can do it. No. He made a lot of promises he should have known he couldn't be. Anybody else who looked at him knew he couldn't be happening. He has to bear that. In the meantime, some of these issues have gotten worse. Homelessness has actually gotten worse, for example. And in the housing situation, it's gotten worse. All of the legislation they have passed in Sacramento over the last 7 or 8 years, dozens and dozens of bills meant to increase housing construction, we're actually going down, not up. All these things have had virtually no impact on the actual housing situation in California. We're actually building fewer houses a day than we were 10 years each year. He has to take it. He has to bear that as he goes on to probably a presidential. A lot of this has come up to haunt. Some of it's a little too esoteric to even register in a political context. But I would envision that anyone running against him, either another Democrat for the nomination or a Republican, if he wins the nomination, is going to show a lot of video on the streets in Sacramento with all these homelessness encampments and say, this is California. If you want this for the rest of the country, elect Gavin Newsom. And he's going to have to bear that. Plus, there's a generalized kind of prejudice against California in other states just because people see it as it's a land of nuts, a nutty place, kind of a foreign country. He has to overcome that as well as these specific things that people will cite in his governorship. He does not, in my estimation, have a strong legacy that he can really run. He's trying to do it. He's cherry-picked stuff like California's got the fourth biggest economy in the world. What does that mean if you have the highest rate of poverty of any state in the United States? You can't claim economics, but he cherry-picks the data to try to picture California, a California that is actually at odds with the reality. And these things are real. The homelessness problem is real. Poverty problem is real. Housing problem is real. All these things are real. People know it. Californians certainly know it. And he's trying to slide past that in the presidential debate, but he's going to have a tough mountain to climb on that basis.
To me, this seems like the most open governor's race in California for 2026 that we've seen in a long time. Is that true?
I call it the weirdest governor's race.
The weirdest. Why?
It went on for months. This stage of the game in virtually any past governor's said, we know who the candidates are and we have the idea of who the leaders are. We don't even know who the candidates are exactly. There are 9 Democrats and 2 Republicans, not counting the ego runners that put their name on the ballot, but serious candidates was that. 2 Republicans and 9 Democrats. That's incredible. That's wacky. Why aren't these Democrats that are scoring 2 and 3 and 4% dropping out when they're 2, 3, 4% of the poll? Why aren't they dropping out?
Do that. Why aren't they dropping out? Especially
they have nothing to lose because there is no front runner. No front runner. The latest poll has the best of it at 24%. But that poll doesn't even include Matt Mahan. That poll is not to be trusted. The fact is that none of these candidates are setting the world on fire. None of them is really seen in the media, at least. Because at this stage of the game, we in the media are the judge and jury. We decide who's to be considered a serious candidate. Same thing goes on in presidential. I once interviewed the governor when he was governor of Arizona. I asked him what he was going to run for president. He said, depends on the great mentioners. I said, who are the great mentioners? He said, ABC, CBS, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post. If they decide that you're a candidate and they start covering you, you are a candidate. If the great mentioners don't mention you, you're not a candidate. And then the world's changed a lot since time in terms of media, obviously. But at this stage of the game, we in the media are the mixers. If we talk about somebody running for governor and we cover them and we cover what they say and everything, that's one thing. But if you're down there at 1% of polls, you're not going to get quoted. And why do they keep running? Because nobody has really emerged in the media and in polls as being the favorite. And as long as there is no favorites, then the also runs, they have no reason to not at least maintain the fiction that they're running.
Is there a scenario in California's jungle primary where you could see that the 2 Republicans make it through and not one Democrat makes it through?
If all the Democrats stay on, now they're all on, the ones that got to be on the ballot, you can't take your name off the ballot. Certain point. You've got to be on, the name's got to be on that ballot. But yes, there is a possibility that if you have 9 Democrats on the ballot, and I think there's a very outside chance that the 2 Republicans show up as the 1 and 2 places in the top 2 primary in June. It's Paul Mitchell, who's the probably the best handicapper. He's the guy who wrote all the 50 districts, by the way, in the 52 districts in the Proposition 50. He thinks there's a 17% chance the 2 Republicans wind up on the ballot. I think that's about right. I think there's an outside chance it can happen. But it all depends on the Democratic Party. If they continue to have 9 candidates actively campaigning, each of which will get some of 2% here, 4% there, 5%, and they can't quite get past it. I would guess that maybe anybody who can get 25% is going to be on that ballot, be on the November ballot, I think.
And are there party bosses like in the olden days, the good old boy for less of a term that would say to a couple of these people, it's time to step aside before it's too late to withdraw your name? Or does that not happen anymore? It's
The people who will do that will be the financiers of politics. It will depend on where the unions want to give their money, where the other interest groups, where Silicon Valley gives its money. In Tom Steyer, you have a self-finance candidate, but it didn't work for him this. But the people who will decide this thing, if people to drop out, will be the inability of those down at the bottom to raise any serious money. And that's why I think there's a pretty good chance that Matt Mahan and Tom Steyer will wind up being the two main contenders here, because those two are going to have money. Tom Steyer's got his own money. I think Silicon Valley will spend whatever it takes to get Matt Mahan in the 1 or 2 position. Silicon Valley is the sleeping giant that's woke up. They never paid any attention to California politics. It didn't need to. They didn't think they needed it. I think that the wealth tax measure on the ballot, the efforts to regulate AI, there's a bunch of things happening in California politics now that's made Silicon Valley kind of wake up. And they're creating all sorts of new PACs to finance legislative races to try to get Democrats more friendlier to Silicon Valley elected to the legislature, to Congress. And I think they want Matt Mahan to be governor because they see that the left-leaning segments of the Democratic Party are turned against Silicon Valley on the basis because of AI and some other things, a lot of other things, because a lot of the people in Silicon Valley have seemingly catered to Donald Trump. For whatever reason, Silicon Valley now feels like it's a target for taxes,
and
for regulation, and all that. And I have a hunch, it's just a hunch, that Tom Steyer and Matt Mahan will wind up as people with the most money in this campaign and will probably be battling it out right towards the end. They may not make 1 and 2. And a lot of the things is going to be is, well, a Republican, even if you'll have 2 Republicans on the ballot, well, 1 Republican makes the ballot. Or will you have a Democrat versus Democrat situation? And it's the Democrat versus Democrat, the model for that is what happened with Dianne Feinstein's last Senate campaign, where she wound up running against the former leader of the state Senate, Kevin De Leon, for the Senate seat. He actually got the Democratic Party endorsement, but of course he lost to Dianne Feinstein anyways. That's the model for a 2 Democrat runoff. The models for the other one is what happened in the 2024 U.S. Senate race, where Adam Schiff spent all sorts of money to promote Steve Garvey as the Republican, but he didn't have to face Katie Porter in the runoff. Those are the 2 models, and which model it will be in the end is a very interesting. Or a third model, which would be two Republicans on the ballot. And that's part of the game of this race. In a sense, it's a race for number 2. Number 1 will, I think, emerge. But again, the question is, who's going to be number 2? Who's going to get into the runoff? Is it going to be a Republican that's the Democratic nominee? Almost easily. Will it be another Democrat? Say, could Steyer and Mahan wind up on the ballot, running it off in November? These are all possibilities. But until we start getting some polling and until the financiers make their choices, none of this will become evident. We've got probably at least a few more weeks before we find out what the actual parameters of the campaign for governor is this year. But it's very late in the game compared to past history. We've known by this time, we know who's the likely next governor. We don't have any clues to who the next governor is at this point this year.
Let's talk about taxes on the ballot. There are, and I know you cover statewide, but in the Bay Area, there's a ton of taxes, right? There's the most notable is the 5-county transit tax, the Safe Park and public transit. But you also have, I know in Contra Costa County, you have a healthcare tax on. Santa Clara just had a healthcare tax special election in November. You have a community college bond. You have at least 10 school districts in the East Bay going out to ballot. You've got all of these things. And then in 2028, there's other transit taxes that have to go on the ballot, other school taxes, city taxes. At some point, people are just going to, I can't imagine that we're going to keep saying yes to all these taxes. What are your thoughts on this? How does everybody break through and what is going on?
The question is California ready for another tax revolt? We've had them in the past, as you well know. And I think what you're saying is accurate. There's a lot piling on going on in taxation, not only just in the Bay Area, but all over the state. I think it's somewhat, particularly because it's axiomatic right now that Californians are very worried about their personal finances, about the effects of inflation, the cost of living in California. We just had a new batch of data come out of the federal government saying that California is the most expensive state in which to live of any of the states, even including Hawaii. It's 11% above the national average. But whether it's gas prices or utility costs, which are horrifically high in California, housing costs, all these things, people are feeling the pinch. At some point, I think that could manifest itself in a, I don't want to pay any more taxes revolt of some kind. What we're really talking about here, probably more than anything, is the sales tax. We have four major tax sources in California. We have the state income tax, we have the state corporate income tax, we have the local property taxes, and we have the sales tax, which is both a state and a local tax. The state tax, sales tax in California is about 7.5% or something, 7.25%, something like that. And then localities put additional taxes on top of that. And in some cases, we're already above 10% on sales tax in some localities already. In theory, sales tax cannot go more than 2 cents over the state tax. In practice, it does all the time because local communities go to the legislature and say, give us permission to go beyond the 2% cap. And the legislature always says yes. There's something like 114 localities in California that now have taxes beyond the 2% cap. I do think there's going to be a backlash on that at some point. And also we have on the ballot potentially some anti-tax measures that are aimed at new taxes. Yes, this is going to be a year where tax policy gets a pretty strong area on the ballot. And I do think with the cost of living being what it is in California and the sensitivity about it as being what it is in California, at some point, the pro-tax movements will wear out their welcome. And granted, certain taxes have been rejected around the state. The Supreme Court a few years ago made it easier for localities to raise taxes. And one of the ballot measures would cut off that Supreme Court ruling and make it harder to raise taxes. The tax thing, I think, is going to be, it may not get to the notoriety and the level of the Proposition 13 tax revolt in 1970. But I do think there is the beginnings of a potential kickback on taxes in California. A lot of these taxes are being proposed, including the wealth tax, to offset reductions in money coming from the federal government, healthcare particularly. And will localities, will local citizens say, oh, why should I pick up the slack? Because I get less money than maybe you guys need a little reality check, something like that. I think that's particularly true, by the way, of your transit tax, Pius County area. There's a lot of very vocal, and I think in many cases justified criticism of BART on how it has spent the money it already has. And that's even true among a lot of Democrats. They feel that BART is they're not getting their money's worth now because BART is under control of the unions and they're giving the unions everything they want and really getting the customer with that. Well, I think that that's going to be one of those test cases on taxation is going to be the 5-county Bay Area transit tax.
That's a whole other conversation you and I
That
can
is a whole
have
other
about.
conversation.
All right, we've got a few minutes left. There's probably a lot that I could ask you about the history of California. Let's do two broad, open-ended questions. One, where do you think the future of California is going politically, policy-oriented? And then we'll go back. The second one, we'll look at some history.
I think for the foreseeable future, probably the rest of my lifetime anyway, California will continue to be a very blue state. And it will probably continue to see stagnation in population. We never quite got to 40 million. I think we'll probably never get to 40 million, to tell you the truth. I think it's that. It's not only people leaving California more than coming in, it's also a very, very lower birth rate, much lower rate of immigration. You put all those demographic factors together, even if we were to not lose many people to other states, which we 10 million in the last, since the turn of the century, something like that. I think after the 90 census, we picked up something like 8 or 9 congressional seats. We had a huge population growth in the 1980s. From 1980 to 1990, we grew by 6 million. We have not grown at all since the last census. At all. If anything, we've lost a little. I think that we're not going to see that growth. It means we have fewer people in Congress, fewer electoral votes in presidential races. It means that we have more of an aging population, because we were at one time, we were producing a baby every single minute, 24 hours a day in California. 525,000 babies a year. That's a fraction of what it was then.
Now you've got towns that won't turn over, schools in affluent communities that can't get enough enrollment.
But they're facing financial problems, and they have all these inefficient schools, basically. The population, therefore, will get older. We'll have a lot more of me, essentially, more older people, which changes a lot of political, demographic, and economic data. It means fewer workers, more retirees with healthcare problems. It means all sorts of things to not have an expanding population. On the other hand, if you're not growing, maybe it helps the housing problem solve itself over time. There's a lot of things that emanate from having a stagnant population as opposed to having a growing population. And those fallout effects will be very evident in the future. And people will regret we didn't plan for that. We didn't plan for all of this. We have a state that has the highest unemployment rate in the United States. Highest of any state. That's over 1 million people are officially unemployed in California. That's people in the workforce who are not working. 1 million.
Hey, but we're number one. Oh, wait, that's not good.
No, we're number one in weather rate. And we're number one in poverty. And we're number one in economic disparity. We're number one in a lot of things that Gavin Newsom never backs. I think having a labor force is going to be difficult in California in the future. There'll be fewer people in the labor force ages, roughly 18 to 65. And we also have a very low level of labor force utilization. In other words, we have a low factor of the people in that working force age who are actually working. Only about 60%. But we have labor shortages already, particularly in blue collar trades like truck drivers and mechanics, and people like that, carpenters and plumbers and electricians. We had shortage. Even if we had all the things cleared out for building more housing in California, we don't have the people to build it. In years past, people would come to California during its boom times and just work in the trades because there was a lot of opportunity here. They don't come now. Why? They can't afford to live here either. But they don't come to California. People don't do that anymore because they can't afford to live in California. They don't come to California. So we're going to have workforce shortages. These are things that are likely to be on California's future. And managing all of this, having a stagnant population as opposed to have a growing population will be a huge political thing. But I don't think the politicians who are running for governor or those already in office have a slightest clue to how that's going to affect us any more than they had the slightest clue back in the 80s when our population was exploding.
The smaller cities that have prevented growth, from a Rio Vista and a Sassoon to Moraga, and even a Pleasanton, which is bigger and has permitted growth, are all having structural deficit problems. And the long term doesn't look good. And Band-Aids are great to temporarily fix a cut, but they don't solve the problem. And a lot of them, for fighting growth, are going to continue to have major problems like you're talking about with the school districts.
Another problem is that Little Sugar sent a lot of money into California during the pandemic. They just opened and shoveled money into school districts and cities and state government. What did those people do? They turned around and gave their employees all big raises. They used one-time money to finance permanent increases in outcome. And they're all feeling the pinch because of that right now. That was stupidity. You don't find ongoing expenses with one-time money. If you do that, you're setting yourself up for failures. But the pressure on city councils, boards of supervisors, school districts was incredible from their unions. You got all this money, give us a raise. And now they have to face the consequences, what they gave away in terms of raises or expanded pension benefits or whatever else, healthcare benefits, whatever they gave up. Now they've got to finance all that when their revenues return to normal. And they're also facing the same inflationary problems that we do in our everyday lives. I was stunned the other day to see that the average new car now costs over $50,000. $50,000.
Yeah.
That's more than I paid for my first house. My first house I ever bought that's $25,000.
Adam Schiff talks about his father making it in the East Bay at $12,000 a year as a tailor.
It's you have all these things going on, and I don't think that the political, not only the current political leadership, but those who aspire to be governor really have a clue as to what they're letting themselves in for, or the kind of challenges they're going to face from the demographic and economic trends that are now underway. Another one of those things you have to worry about is the flight of business to Texas and everything else. The wealth tax is some of it, but there's been an outflow of corporate headquarters out of California now for a number of years. Chevron and Bank of America and on and on. So, Elon Musk and his operations and everything. That's going to bite in the long run. It's going to bite. And I don't think the people, again, in political power, really, it's very difficult in politics to have a longer term view because you have so many things on your plate that are right now that you got to deal with right now. And it's very difficult to step aside or step back and say, what about the future? And the politics, unfortunately, tends to be long range of politics is the next election cycle. It is what it is. But when you're dealing with issues that are long in their nature, whether it's population growth or workforce or rising number of elderly people or whatever it be, that are long-term things, politics has a very difficult time dealing with those things because everything is right there in front of them right here. And now we got to deal with it right now. Politics, we have this kind of I consider strange notion that politics is a leading issue, that politics is that people in politics are the head of the parade they're the drum majors, they're leading things. They're not. Politics is not a proactive business. Politics is a reactive business. They're the people at the end of the parade with the scoop shovels. Really, I just wish they wouldn't leave much out there to be scooped up. They react to things to demographic, economic, cultural factors change society. I've only ever had one governor, in my experience, who's actually seriously talked about the future. And that, believe it or not, was Pete Wilson. He came into the governorship as an advocate of what he called preventive government, of not waiting to respond to issues when they arise, but try to prevent the negative things from happening rather than trying to deal with them after they happen. And he had an extraordinary stretch of really bad luck. Every county in California was declared a disaster area at least one time during Wilson's governorship. He had to deal with serious recession, floods, fires, earthquakes, and riots, and everything. He had this stuff that just went on day after day. He shrugged his shoulders and said, I can't get to preventive government. I can't get to doing things. I have to deal with all these emergencies. He shrugged his shoulders and said, okay, that's the hand was dealt. Deal with it. But he really wanted to be he wanted to be a Tory reformer. They call him in England, a conservative person who wants to be a reformer rather than a reactor. And he never got the chance to do that. His time ran out and he was still dealing with all these crises. But I don't even see the current politicians trying to. Gavin Newsom talks about it, but he always reverts back to the same reactive sort of thing that those politicians. Because if you were really serious about it, you'd be dealing with these demographic and economic and cultural, and this is just typical political. If they settle for what I would call a swipe, they do something that admits we have a problem that's going to be resolved, and we're going to take a swipe at it now. But they're never any very fundamental sorts of things. They're more like a press release thing. All they do is you announce that you've done something, but that something doesn't really deal with the issue. He's a master of the swipe, and most politicians are, because they don't want to really take on the heavy lifting that would take to do with seriously deal with some of these issues. But they all deal with the fallouts from all those things now. And that's the nature of politics. It's more reactive than proactive by its nature.
Was that your advice to future political figures and to voters, is look proactive, start looking long-term?
As a person or as a family, you should look ahead. Will the money be there when my kids go to college? Will I have the money there when I'm going to retire? What do I need to do to not wind up poor or not wind up huge debts? I should be doing something about that. And the people who do that make out better in the long run. The people who don't do that, who live paycheck to paycheck and crisis to crisis, right to credit cards, everything, they wind up in the hole. They never can get ahead. What's true of us as individuals and as families is also true of us as a society. We need to look ahead. We need to see. It's funny, we used to do that. If you look back at California during the post-war era, from 1945 to not 1975, that's a 30-year period we were doing that. We were looking ahead. We were building the infrastructure, the water systems, the colleges, all the things that we needed in terms of public goods to deal with what we knew was coming from a large population growth. Politics was actually very sensitive to the future at that point in California's history. And then it all stopped just about the time Jerry Brown became governor the first time. He proclaimed we were an era of limits. We weren't going to grow anymore. We didn't have to build anything more. It was almost a juvenile reaction to his father, who had been the builder, who built the water system, the colleges. He was in rebellion against his father. And if you know anything about their personal dynamics, which I do, it's understandable because they were personally. I had seen both of them be within 6 feet of each other in a room with other people and never acknowledge each other's existence. Pat Brown, whenever he would meet somebody from Sacramento, including me, he would say, "How's Jerry doing? How's my boy doing?"
I think
It's about a race for a U.S. Senate, and it's modeled on Jared Brown and Pat Brown. And there's a point at which Melvin Douglas, he plays Robert Redford's father, the former governor, enters a room and he talks to somebody and says, "How's my boy doing?" I have heard those exact words from Pat Brown on several occasions. They did.
Well,
If you go into the Jerry Brown archives in the state library, there are a lot of letters there from Pat Brown giving Jerry advice. But the letters are not to Jerry. They're to his chief of staff, Ray Davis, saying Jerry ought to do this, Jerry ought to do that. Jerry. Anyway, I think that Jerry came into the governorship declaring an era of limits. We weren't going to be growing anymore. And at that time, our population was in a little bit below. The baby boom had ended in 65. We were now in 75. We were closing down schools because school enrollment was declining. And Jerry said, we don't need any of this stuff. We're not going to be growing anymore. We don't need more highways. We don't need more schools. We don't need more colleges. We don't need more water supplies. He was absolutely wrong. Population of California, when he was elected governor, the population of California was around 21, maybe 22 million. It hit 24 million in the 1980 census, 30 million in the 1990 census. 9 million. But he and the rest of the political establishment said, we don't need to do this stuff. They did all this stuff. Pat Brown did all this stuff. Gavin, Earl Warren did all this stuff. We don't need to do that stuff anymore. They were wrong. They were absolutely wrong.
that's a great perspective. And that comes up with the California forever, the new city in Solano County, is people are like, there's not enough roads to go there. There's not enough water, or there's not this. And it's, you know what? If you really attract 200 to 400,000 people, whether that happens or not, and if you attract a shipbuilding, whether that happens or not, those from seen, the infrastructure will start developing around it. Because if there are people, I do believe it will get built. Because Earl Warren and Pat Brown did it. Because 80 wasn't built waiting for people. You're shaking your head no. Hit me
I
with
say,
that.
listen, if you want a new city of 200,000 or 400,000 people, if the state's population isn't growing, which it was back during that Pat Brown and growing a lot, where are those people going to come from? Where are they going to move from if they're going to go to this new city? If you lack overall population growth. Now, they formed many new cities back during the city of Irvine, for example, right out there in the middle of nowhere. There's been a number of cities that grew up during that period of high population growth. But we don't have population growth now. We're not likely to have any to speak of. Where are these people going to come from?
I'm not the expert
Either, but I'm saying
my assumption would be that they believe that people still want to come to California if there is affordable housing and good jobs.
affordable. Are they going to have houses that are $200,000 or $100,000?
No, they're not going to do that because you can't do that. But I think affordable comparatively to San Mateo and the Tri-Valley.
Where people with six-figure incomes live in house trailers.
We'll see.
I can understand a new city. I think the idea of a new city is terrible in itself. I'm not sure about the shipbuilding business, but you have to have the potential customers for all this stuff you're going to do. I don't know where those potential customers are going to be coming from.
Dan Walters from CalMatters, I really appreciate you being here. I learned a lot just having this conversation, and I appreciate your perspective. And maybe we'll have you back on before the next election cycle here.
All righty. Anytime.
Hey, I really appreciate your time, Dan.
Thanks for listening to the Capstone Conversation. Don't forget to subscribe and follow Jared Asch and Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Leave us a review and share this episode with a friend.